Talk of Elvis Presley and racism has been inextricably linked for decades. There have been accusations of cultural appropriation, taking advantage of black musicians, and even one horrible quote that would haunt his legacy for decades. But is there any truth to any of it? Can musicians take influences from various cultures and apply them to their own music in a unique and respectable manner? Was Elvis a straight-up racist? Let's explore. I'm Lorne, and on Everything is Gray, we delve into the societal impact of artists and individuals who have profoundly influenced our lives. We strive to reconcile their contributions with their actions and beliefs. One of the biggest issues was that there's a quote that's been circulating for years where he supposedly said, "The only thing Negroes can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes." But did Elvis actually say or believe this? While Elvis continues to have many admirers and supporters in the black community, there still remains a contingent that accuses him of being a racist. Artists ranging from Quincy Jones to Public Enemy. Elvis's early life is crucial to understanding his supposed racism, as the roots of racism usually take hold in childhood, based upon your friends, family, and surroundings. Elvis had originally grown up in Tupelo, Mississippi for the first 13 years of his life. His family was basically a poor working-class family. His family relied upon government assistance while his father worked many odd jobs. When Elvis was 3 years old, the family lost their home after his father, Vernon, was convicted of check fraud and spent 8 months in jail. The family then moved to the Hill neighborhood of Tupelo. The Hill consisted mostly of African-American families. However, the small family was able to secure residence in housing that was designated as white. This was in the 1940s in the South, so Jim Crow laws regarding segregation of races was in full effect. When Elvis was 11 years old, his mother Gladys bought him his first guitar for $7.75 from the Tupelo Hardware Company. This is the guitar Elvis would use throughout high school and all the way through his recording sessions at Sun Records. One of his good friends was a kid named Sam Bell. Sam Bell was a young black boy about the same age as Elvis. He shared stories about how they would go to movies together, with Elvis jumping over the railing that said "colored only."
Yeah, we had our fun at that theater. It's still there on Broadway, and we only had a white section and a black section. We thought we were sneaking in. He'd go on the white side, and I'd go on the black side. And the blacks would only sit upstairs. And they had a petition up there. The whites sit over there too, but the blacks had a section too. But they just had a petition. You could step over it. I'd sneak in. We sneak in on the black side. He thought he was sneaking in on the white side. We all thought we were sneaking in, but he knew what we were doing. And then as soon as we get up there, he'd come on over and climb on over. And we sit in the aisle and watch all the movies and westerns and all that. Y'all, you know what? Y'all thought y'all were really getting away with something. He said, but I knew what you were doing. He said, as long as you didn't occupy a seat, it was all right. So he let us stay there. We sit in the aisle and watch all those movies.
There are many potential myths regarding Elvis's history in Tupelo. Many legends exist of Elvis hanging out and learning music in the Shake Rag area of Tupelo. Shake Rag was a poor black part of town that was originally founded by freed slaves.
We come all the way over what they call Shake Rag, across the track. That's where they had the barbershops and cafes. And the guys sit out there with the guitars and play the music stuff. And he got really intrigued with that. He liked the blues and stuff. We didn't listen to a lot. We hear the blues, but we didn't tune into a lot of blues, you know. We listened to the Moonglows and something like that. He would like that blues, man. And they'd teach him. They show him what they could. They didn't treat him bad. Took him under the wing, treated him better than they did us. And he really enjoyed that long there. And then we had to get back home before dark. So back up the hills. He had a manner about him, yes ma'am, no ma'am, which we did too. But being white back there at that time. And my grandparents, you know, from way back, my granddaddy, you know, white people just didn't say yes ma'am, no sir. But he would. We had to. But he'd come in. He didn't have to if he didn't want to. He'd come in, yes, ma'am, and she just loved him to death, my grandma. And I was her pick, so he was her other pick. So that kind of got to him that he was that manable. He could come in that house. He didn't have to knock. He'd just come in, go in, and lay down, and get him something out of the refrigerator, whatever he wanted. He had a run of the meal at that house, and they just loved him. And I heard it so bad when he had to leave. He told us one day that when he get ready to go, he said, I got to move. And we sort of hated. You know, he was a different kind of guy. He was he wasn't boastful, but he was kind of guy like, I got to do better.
When Elvis was 13, his family moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Throughout his teenage years, Elvis would spend time around Beale Street in downtown Memphis. Beale Street was a haven for black music, starting with the jazz and blues in the 1900s and still carries through today. Beale Street was a popular destination for artists to perform, such as Louis Armstrong, B.B. King, and Muddy Waters. One of the biggest influences on Elvis was the WDIA radio station. In the 1940s, WDIA would mostly play country and western music. The station owners realized that half of the listeners within range of WDIA were black, so they began programming in 1948 that would appeal to black listeners. In 1954, Sam Phillips, the legendary producer and owner of Sun Studios, recorded Elvis Presley doing a rendition of Arthur Crudup's 1949 song, That's All Right. Arthur Crudup was a Delta blues singer from Mississippi. His composition and recording of That's All Right is an up-tempo, toe-tapping song that has a solid blues foundation. Many people consider it to be one of the first rock and roll records. Elvis wound up recording his version for Sam Phillips' Sun Records. Elvis's version traded the blues overtones of Crudup's version with more of a country tinge to create a standout rockabilly song. Phillips was then able to get an interview on WHBQ radio with DJ Dewey Phillips, where he would play his record and interview him. Now at the time, the schools of Memphis were segregated. There were black schools and there were white schools. During his interview with Elvis, Dewey subtly asked him where he went to high school. The 19-year-old Elvis responded with Humes High School. This was Dewey's way of letting the audience know that Elvis was white. After this point, Elvis's career skyrocketed. And with his skyrocketing career came dark allegations of racism. Sepia Magazine was a white-owned magazine that catered to the black community in the U.S. In 1957, Sepia printed an article titled, What Negroes Think of Elvis. In this article, they quoted Elvis as saying, "The only thing Negroes can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes." This quote went on to haunt Elvis during the late 1950s. Some sources believed that Elvis had said it at a show in Boston. Elvis never played in Boston at that time. Others brought up that he said it on Edward R. Murrow's person-to-person TV program, on which Elvis never appeared. To get to the bottom of this, journalist Louis Robinson from Jet Magazine, another magazine catering towards black people in the United States. However, Jet Magazine was a black-owned periodical with a much better reputation than Sepia. Robinson was unable to track down the original source of the supposed Elvis quote. Robinson then went out and tracked down black musicians that Elvis had worked with. He interviewed Dudley Brooks, a black piano player on many of Elvis's recordings. Brooks told him, "He faces everybody as a man. I never heard of the remark, but even so, I can't imagine Presley saying that, not knowing him the way I do." Another person he interviewed, Dr. W.A. Zuber, a black physician who grew up with Elvis in Tupelo, stated, "I knew him when he was a kid. He used to play his guitar and go around with quartets and Negro sanctified meetings. He lived near the colored section, and people around here say he's one of the nicest boys they ever knew. He just doesn't impress me as the type of person who would say something like that." After that, Robinson went straight to the source, Elvis himself. Robinson traveled to the set of Jailhouse Rock that Elvis was filming at the time. Asking the question to Elvis if he had said something like that, Elvis replied, "I never said anything like that. And people who know me know I wouldn't have said it." Robinson's article ultimately came to the conclusion that, to Elvis, people are people, regardless of race, color, or creed. Despite zero actual proof that Elvis said that horrible quote, the damage still lingers to this day, passed down from families. People will cling to the notion that Elvis was just a straight-up racist. While Elvis continues to have many admirers amongst black musicians, there are still some that believe he was racist. In 2002, when Mary J. Blige was asked to perform Blue Suede Shoes for an Elvis medley for VH1's Divas Live, she stated, "I prayed about it because I knew Elvis was a racist." In 2021, at the age of 88, the late legendary producer Quincy Jones talked about whether he'd work with Elvis in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter. Jones answered, "No, I wouldn't work with him." When asked why, he responded, "I was writing for Tommy Dorsey, back then in the 50s, and Elvis came in, and Tommy said, I don't want to play with him. He was a racist mother. I'm going to shut up now. But every time I saw Elvis, he was being coached by Otis Blackwell, telling him how to sing." Now, in researching his response, Otis Blackwell was a black songwriter that many of the early rock and roll musicians would work with. He had written Great Balls of Fire and Breathless for Jerry Lee Lewis, as well as Don't Be Cruel and All Shook Up for Elvis. For clarity, Otis Blackwell told David Letterman in 1987 that he had never even met Elvis. There's also no other evidence to suggest that Tommy Dorsey thought that Elvis was racist outside of Quincy Jones's quote. Chuck D, the legendary frontman for the hip-hop group Public Enemy, included references to Elvis in their 1989 song Fight the Power. His lyrics were, "Elvis was a hero to most," followed with, "straight up racist that sucker was. However, 13 years later, Chuck D explained his lyrics in an interview with Newsday. In the article, Chuck D expanded this by stating,
Elvis wasn't a racist or something? Was there some level of retraction or no?
It was no retraction. I was like saying, number one, when I wrote the record, right? We as black people always grew up around Elvis, but why is he the king? Why is he the icon? And I was trying to say in that record, dude, there's not only is there Little Richard still around, Bo Diddley, at that time, everybody was around. Even Jerry Lee Lewis. Not only were they just as iconic and they deserved a king too, or Elvis didn't deserve to be called king, but they were doing gigs.
Yeah.
At the same time. So this whole Elvisism, I was done with.
Along with these disproven accusations of Elvis being a racist, there's been an ongoing discussion of Elvis's appropriation of black music and culture for himself. Upon his death in 1977, many newspapers were mourning the loss of the king of rock and roll. The Chicago Defender, a newspaper at the time, had a different take. They stated, "When Elvis Presley breathed his last breath and the press hailed him as the king of rock, Old Man River cried out, 'Nah, he ain't. My friend Chuck Berry is the king of rock.' Presley was merely a prince who profited from the royal talent of a sovereign ruler vested with tremendous creativity. Had Berry been white, he could have rightly taken his throne and worn his crown as well." To contrast this opinion, the godfather of soul, James Brown, stated,
"Well, soul has no color, it has no barrier. But I also had a lot of good people. But I want to pay a tribute to a good friend of mine, Brother Elvis Presley, who opened up a lot of doors for me to get through. Elvis was a pioneer, and he came out 1 year before I did. He was out in 55, Heartbreak Hotel. And then I come in 56. And Elvis and I were very good friends up until the last minute of his body alive. But he'll always live because of the fact he was such a beautiful man. I don't care what nobody say, I know Elvis. You know, there are a lot of rumors. Elvis and I sang spiritual together. And he'd buy any movie that I make, any film, he'd buy the film and close the theater up and show it. I love Elvis for being a man. I love him for what he done for the people and the chance he gave me. He kept me from being number one. I was number one soul and he was number one world, and it took a long time, but it's almost like the two rental cars. It made me try harder. And I love Elvis for it, and we'll always pray for Elvis.
Despite some naysayers, Elvis would always pay tribute to the black performers that came before him, particularly when it came to Fats Domino. Commercially in the 1950s, Domino, Chuck Berry, and Elvis were the biggest rock acts of the decade. Elvis had a huge admiration for Domino. In a 1957 interview with Jet Magazine, Elvis stated, "A lot of people seem to think I started this business, but rock and roll was here a long time before I came along. Nobody can sing that music like black people. Let's face it, I can't sing like Fats Domino can. I know that." Little Richard, in a 1990 interview, once stated, "I think that Elvis was more acceptable being white back in that period. I believe that if Elvis had been black, he would have been as big as he was. If I was white, do you know how huge I'd be? If I was white, I'd be able to sit on top of the White House. A lot of things they would do for Elvis and Pat Boone, they wouldn't do for me." Now, this wasn't a comment on Elvis directly, but on the imbalance between black and white musicians in the music industry. Little Richard himself was a huge fan of Elvis.
Elvis Presley.
I love him. That's my buddy, my baby. I love him. We are very good friends, and it was a very great loss to the music world. Elvis is one of the greatest performers ever lived in this world, and electrifying, elevated. Oh, he's just, you can't say enough. He's just beautiful. I love Elvis because they opened that wide door. By them being white, they made the door bigger for me to walk through with my songs.
So there isn't any direct evidence of Elvis appropriating black culture. Music continuously evolves and absorbs the styles and techniques of its predecessors. When you listen to Arthur Crudup's original version of That's Alright and compare it to Elvis's, there's a distinct difference. Elvis wasn't trying to rip off his style. He was paying tribute to Crudup while making his own distinct version of the song. Rock and roll was born in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, mostly from black artists. Trailblazers like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Ike Turner, Fats Domino, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe. At the same time, they influenced white trailblazers like Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Elvis. Rock music was new at the time, and certainly not widely accepted like it is today. Race certainly played a role in the success of white artists at the time, that's for sure. It's certainly more palatable for networks to put Elvis on the TV, rather than put Fats Domino on there. This has nothing to do with the artists themselves, but with the entertainment industry and the state of race relations in the US at the time. So far, there's been no evidence of blatant racism from Elvis Presley, but at this point, we're going to be exploring an area that's far more gray. That is the black songwriters that were taken advantage of in the 1950s and beyond. This has been a problem for decades, and these cases are still being litigated today. In the music industry, there are basically two royalties that are paid out for each record sold. The first royalty is the actual recording itself. This will go to the artist. The second of which is the songwriting royalties, or publishing. This is paid out to the songwriters and the publishing company. Now, the songwriting and publishing oftentimes is where the real money is made from a record sale, because the split is often more favorable to the songwriter than the royalty is for the sound recording. Plus, if anybody else covers that song, the artist makes no money from that, unless they're one of the songwriters. In 1956, Elvis signed a management contract with Colonel Tom Parker. Parker was known to be a ruthless manager. In 1968, he was even making more money than Elvis. They had agreed to a 50-50 split of Elvis's earnings. The standard management contract agreement is usually about 15%. However, Parker also retained control of merchandising and more. This is important to know because Elvis did get songwriting credit for songs that he didn't write. However, this was all due to the influence and pressure from Tom Parker. Some of the songs that he took partial songwriting credit were Heartbreak Hotel, All Shook Up, Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Return to Sender. The main black songwriter that Elvis worked with was Otis Blackwell. They had a successful partnership that spanned many, many hits. Was Elvis given songwriting credits and royalties for songs that he may have actually had no input? Absolutely he did. This was a major problem back then, and it's still a major problem today. If a songwriter has a great song, they need a popular performer to record it. The performer or the producer then has all the power. They will then negotiate a songwriting credit for that song. This ensures a much greater share of the money in the future. And the songwriter needs the song to be recorded to make any kind of money. So it's a predatory relationship between songwriters and artists, record labels, and producers. Today, when you look at songwriting credits, you'll usually see a massive list of names behind just a single song. If you think all of those people actually wrote that song, I've got my own song to sell you. Now, this was a rampant problem in the music industry. Black musicians were taken advantage of by unscrupulous record labels. Rarely was the artist involved, but either the producer or the record company executives. Oftentimes, there were even organized crime families involved with stealing songwriting credits. There's no specific evidence of Elvis's involvement with stealing songwriting credits. He did wind up changing a thing or two with the lyrics or melody to suit his style, so it would make sense for him to get some partial songwriting credit. Likely, most of Elvis's getting songwriting credit was influenced by Colonel Tom Parker. From the songwriter's perspective, back in 1955, Mae Axton offered Elvis 30% of songwriting royalties for the song Heartbreak Hotel, if it was the first single he released under his new record company, RCA. This wound up being a fruitful partnership for all the parties involved. Now, Elvis gets accused of covering early rock and roll and R&B songs, and taking away from the artists that originally recorded them. However, all the cover songs Elvis performed, which people think were his original release, songs like That's Alright, Hound Dog, and Mystery Train, these were all songs that had gone through the release cycle and were no longer making money for the artists. Now, Elvis's version of these songs makes these the only versions of these songs the white audience would be familiar with. The original artists were not making much money off the original versions anymore. So in a way, it appears as though Elvis was appropriating these songs from black artists, but it's more likely these songs would have been completely forgotten in time if it weren't for Elvis's admiration for these songs and black artists. I encourage you to listen to some of these original versions, songs like Mystery Train by Junior Parker, That's Alright by Arthur Crudup, and Hound Dog by Big Mama Thornton. They're amazing. The original versions are lively blues heavy renditions. Then listen to Elvis's version. You'll hear a reverence for the original artists, but a transformation with more of a country and rockabilly influence that makes the songs his own. In fact, I've created an Apple Music and Spotify playlist linked in the description for you can easily listen to these songs yourself. There's also the question regarding Elvis and race and his contributions to the civil rights movement. Well, in the early years, Elvis was rarely an outright activist like Marlon Brando or Bob Dylan. Elvis was more of a private supporter. Elvis was one of the few white artists who would appear on black radio stations to be interviewed by black DJs. Elvis was very private with his charitable contributions as well as his private philanthropy. There were reports of Elvis giving away up to 200 Cadillacs to people. He paid off a person's mortgage just for giving him a dime to use a payphone. Elvis donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to charitable organizations that would benefit black people in Memphis. The last topic of discussion is whether or not Elvis performed in segregated venues. This is a bit of a gray area. There were well-known artists at the time that refused any sort of racial segregation, and they had the power to do so when segregation was the norm. Artists like Frank Sinatra and the Beatles would refuse to perform in situations where the audience was segregated. Famously, he attended an all-black performance with B.B. King and others. His contract prevented him from performing, but he made an appearance and showed his support. The all-black crowd went crazy when he gave his signature hip twist. However, there are reports that he may have performed for segregated audiences in Vegas, although this isn't known with any certainty. Elvis had a complicated life. His reverence for black music cannot be overstated. He started his career at the beginning of the civil rights movement and the birth of rock and roll, so comparisons to his black contemporaries are significant. Elvis helped open the door for many black musicians during his time, but his legendary status also overshadowed many of them. Was Elvis a racist? While you never know what's in the heart and mind of your fellow human beings, there's no real evidence Elvis was a racist. Were the lives of past and present black musicians better because Elvis helped open doors that were closed by a racist music industry? I think so. Could he have done more to make the world a more equitable place? Certainly, but can't we all? And I'll close this episode with this final story. At a press conference in 1969 in Las Vegas, a Memphis reporter referred to Elvis as the king of rock and roll. Elvis then pointed to Fats Domino, who was in the room, and exclaimed, "No, that's the real king of rock and roll." My name is Lauren with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode is dedicated to my sister, who was a huge fan of Elvis growing up, and still makes us listen to the Elvis Christmas CD every single Christmas Eve. This episode was written, edited, and produced by Lauren Brigitzer.